In the last video on systemic family therapy conversations, the conclusion that we came to was that in order to manage the extra complexity that being reflective tended to introduce, it was a good idea to use some principle, and the principle that we were using was to focus on the purpose of the conversation. Well, in a way, that seems pretty obvious. Clearly, when you have a conversation, it's going to be driven by some purpose. In fact, it's one of the rules, as it were, of understanding conversations that you look for the intent behind an utterance. There is always some kind of purpose there. So while it seems obvious that you use purpose to focus the conversation, it's not as simple as that because, of course, what is the purpose for a start? Also, you tend to get distracted. Your purpose can change over time, and often you have multiple purposes that you're trying to satisfy. So let's go into some of the detail of that. First of all, distractions. Well, we live in a world of distractions, especially now that we all have smartphones and constantly we're getting emails and text messages and WhatsApp messages and all kinds of communications over various channels for various purposes. And that's quite apart from the fact that you're going to get interruptions from families and friends and work and all sorts of tasks that have to be done. So the default, as it were, is to be operating against a background world of distractions. But then, of course, there's also distractions in conversation. You can sit down in a quiet corner with one person and still get distracted away from the main purpose of the conversation. It's often the case that recent events or recent priorities will over-influence your conversation. So something has happened that morning and you tend to want to talk about it, even though it might not be the most important thing or the most fruitful thing to discuss. Also in conversation, you're often driven by your own concerns and interests, whereas in a professional situation, like being a social worker or a clinician, the need is often to focus on what the other party is saying and to pursue the topics that come out of that and not jump to conclusions as a result of your own assumptions, presuppositions, and ways of seeing the world. So now looking at changing purposes, because during the course of a single conversation or during the course of many conversations, there are a number of reasons you might want to change purposes. For example, inevitably there'll be changes in purpose over time, over the sessions that you spend with a particular client or in conversation. In early sessions you might be gathering information, and you're trying to build a picture of the client's circumstances. You're trying to find out why the client, why that individual or that family is there, if they've come voluntarily or if they've been referred somehow. You may be trying to find out what they're trying to achieve and also explaining what you're trying to achieve. You might be constructing a plan to effect some change. You might be in the course of the execution of that plan and the monitoring of it and seeing how it's going. Inevitably, there are going to be circumstances that change during the execution of some plan, and therefore you're going to have to look at the consequences of those changes and perhaps do some replanning. So throughout a series of sessions, the focus of one's purpose will be changing in any event. Inevitably, the purpose of the conversation will change as the relationship with the client changes. Also, during the course of a single conversation, topics might arise that change the whole focus of the conversation. Somebody might mention something to you which seems to be critical or of great interest in determining what you might do about their situation. Another reason to change purpose would be simply to keep the conversation moving, to keep it fresh and interesting. You might find yourself getting stuck or bogged down in some issue and getting nowhere, and so it's a good idea to change at that point. But really the fact of the matter is that one is always maintaining multiple purposes. Ultimately, in systemic family therapy, the purpose is to service the client's needs to correct something that is wrong as far as they're concerned, to change their situation. So in order to make that correction, you need to effect change, and in order to effect change, you need to somehow perturb their situation or make them think about it in a different way, to reframe it. And in order to be able to do that, you need to agree some common understanding of what's going on, some common model of what the current situation is and how it might be changed. And in order to do that, you have to collect information about their circumstances. And in order to do that, you have to build some kind of rapport or trust with them. And one way of doing that is to ask their permission about areas that you can explore, particularly the sensitive areas that might be the roots to perturbing the situation and affecting the greatest change. So all these purposes can be in your mind at once. They do have some sort of structure, as I've illustrated there. If you start with the ultimate purpose of trying to correct something that the family or the person that has come to see you regards as wrong or needing adjustment, and then work backwards through effecting change and agreeing common models and building rapport and so on, you can see that structure emerging. In fact, if you start with the end in mind of making some correction and then ask how do you do it, how do you correct the situation, how do you effect change, how do you perturb the situation or reframe it, how do you agree a common model. The way of agreeing a common model is to collect the information in order to construct the model in the first place, to co-construct it. And how do you get that information? Well, you're not going to get it without building the rapport and the trust. So at every stage, if you ask how, you will trace back your reasons, as it were, for carrying out all the steps on the way. Also, you can work the other way. Say you are probing some sensitive area in somebody's life, and therefore you're asking their permission to go down that conversational avenue. Then why are you doing that? Well, why are you asking permission? You're asking permission because you don't want to offend them in some way. You want to build their trust. You want to build that rapport. Why do you want to build the rapport? In order that you can collect more information. Why do you want to collect more information? Because you want to come to some common agreement about how the situation is, albeit perhaps very complicated. And why do you want to come to a common agreement? It's because you want to find out how to perturb the situation or reframe how you think about it in order to effect change, and that is being done in order to correct something that's wrong. So we've just traced through that structure by asking why at every stage, in contrast to having started at the end and asked how do you do each step. Now, although that structure might exist in your mind or it might exist in the mind of the client if you map it out with them, it's not necessarily the way that the conversations are going to be structured, or not necessarily the way that any individual conversation. And an individual conversation could dart around all over the place. Sometimes you're coming across something which seems a particularly sensitive issue, and therefore you want to ask permission, and so your purpose becomes asking for permission to go down that avenue. Once you have the permission, your purpose might change to exploring exactly what that sensitive issue is and how it impacts on that person or on that family. Conversations rarely proceed in a linear manner. Things get mentioned and those act as triggers to exploring them in a bit more depth. So it's not unusual to jump around, and it's not necessary to keep a strict focus. What is necessary is not to become distracted and deviate from any of the purposes, And what seems to be a useful strategy is to take the opportunity to explore things when they do come up in conversation and when it seems right to be able to do that, while making sure that you're keeping track, at least in your mind, of the whole picture and making sure that it's on the road to the ultimate purpose of correcting something that that person or family perceive is wrong. So let's just look for a moment at the juggling of these multiple purposes, especially as some of these purposes are going to be in tension with each other. They're partly in tension because they consume the limited resources that you have available, the limited time you have available to explore things. So if you start talking about plans, then perhaps you're having less resources available to talk about gaining permission. So looking in particular at the purposes of effecting change and at the same time building and maintaining a rapport and a trust between you and the individual or the family, those things can often be in tension, because the best way in which you might affect change is to identify issues that are very sensitive. In other words, the issues that perhaps the client is reluctant to talk about and reluctant to explore, things that they even protect themselves from, let alone talk about to other people. So there's often a tension between trying to effect change and maintaining the trust and rapport. And this is indeed the area of what we're calling relational risk. In other words, if you explore sensitive issues without asking permission or without being aware of the fact that they are sensitive, then you are risking the rapport that you've already built up. However, on the other hand, you're not going to make any progress in being able to identify how to make changes without uncovering some of those sensitive issues. So inevitably, you will find that there's a dilemma. To some extent, the dilemma can be resolved by asking permission, by going slowly, by approaching a sensitive subject from a number of different angles until you find a way into it. Perhaps somehow reframing the sensitive subject before you get to it so that it doesn't seem so threatening, or a variety of other techniques like externalization, so not making that sensitivity an attribute of the person, but separating it from the person and treating it as if you and the person are looking at it as some external object. So to summarize, while it may seem obvious that you drive a conversation over a single or a series of sessions by the purpose, it's not as simple as that, because there are multiple purposes. Purposes can change and you can be distracted. So while it makes sense to say that you should be focused on your purpose, it doesn't make sense to be rigidly sticking to a single conversational plan, as it were. You have to interleave a structured approach with the opportunities that arise as conversations naturally progress, and you have to maintain multiple purposes, in particular the building and maintenance of a trusting relationship which enables the rest of the dialogue to take place in a more fluid and productive way.